Hey everyone, please support what I do to help keep Greyhawk alive by subscribing to the channel. Also, please consider becoming a channel member to get early access to videos, exclusive live chats, quarterly adventure modules, and more. Thanks, and enjoy the show. With all the news about Wizards of the Coast and the OGL and all that stuff lately, a lot of people have been looking for alternatives to 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. And I thought it would be helpful to give a quick guide on how to go from playing 5th edition to an OSR game, today on Greyhawk Grognard. Now, OSR stands for Old School Revival, or Old School Renaissance, or Old School Rules, or Old School Revolution, however, whatever. The key being, it's an older style of play using rules that are either themselves old or are trying to emulate those older rules. So, for the purposes of this video, I'm talking about things like basic Dungeons & Dragons, Holmes Basic, or BECMI, or even White Box. I'm talking about Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, 1st or 2nd edition. I'm talking about then retro clones like Labyrinth Lord, Swords and Wizardry, Adventures Dark and Deep, which is my own game. There's a lot of the old school essentials. There's a lot of old school games out there now, and that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And I thought it would be interesting to go through some of the differences between 5th edition and those kinds of games to give you a feel for what the transition is going to be like. Now, first, I want to start with kind of the big picture of how these games play before we get into specifics about mechanics and stuff like that. And you've probably heard, if you've heard about OSR at all, you've heard that it's a deadlier game, and this is very true. 5th edition D&D makes it very difficult for characters to die, right? You get death saves, you get short rests and long rests that you recoup hit points almost immediately. So it cushions the characters and makes them much more robust in combat. In OSR games, that is very much not the case. You have a much smaller pool of hit points. There are many fewer options when you are brought to 0 hit points or below. And things in general tend to be more deadly. Healing goes a lot slower. The standard for 1st edition, for example, is you get back 1 hit point per day of rest. And that's it. So if you've taken, you need to get back 20 hit points, you're going to be out for 3 weeks of game time. And that's very deliberate. That is how they were designed. And part of that is because the game wants to push you into a place where combat is to be avoided if possible, which is something that differentiates it from 5th edition. 5th edition is very much focused on combat situations, and thus it has to give you ways to recover from those combat situations quicker. Old school games don't do that. Old school games want to punish you for getting into combat in most cases. So that is a first thing to remember, is that mindset is that OSR games are going to be deadlier, and it's going to be harder and slower to recover after a combat. Next up, we have the modularity issue. 5th edition is very much a unified game. It is designed to be very tightly designed so that all the pieces and parts interact with each other very intricately and very precisely, and it discourages changing parts over here because you don't know what the impact could be over here. And that's deliberate. It has a unified mechanic. It's supposed to act like that, and the reason for it is that it gives players a more unified experience across the board. So when you try to do something in combat, it works one way, and when you try to do something using a skill, for example, it works exactly the same way. Old school games tend not to do that. especially the original old school games. Newer old school games like Swords and Wizardry, Labyrinth Lord, they tend to kind of smooth things over. But the original games were very much modular, and they treated different activities differently mechanically. So, for example, combat works one way in first edition AD&D. You want to roll high on a d20 to see if you can hit the monster. But on the other hand, if you are trying to do something else, you want to roll low on percentile dice, because let's say you have a 30% chance of doing something, you want to roll between 1 and 30. So this is where the famous sometimes you roll high, sometimes you roll low comes from. And it can be annoying and confusing at first, but once you get the hang of it, and your DM should be able to help you, they'll say, roll a d20, you want to roll high, roll percentile, you want to roll low. They can help you through that transition. And the reason for this is not just to annoy you. The reason is unintentional, but it's still there. It allows the DM to kind of swap things out and tinker. It makes it much easier if you want to try an alternate combat system. You can do that in an old school game much easier than you can in 5th edition. So back in the day, for example, we used to play Dungeons and Dragons, and for a time we were using the combat system from Arms Law and Claw Law, and it worked. It was just you ignored the combat system in D&D. You took Arms Law and Claw Law. You used that combat system. You scaled the hit points, and off you went. And the rules didn't fight you when you did that, because they are so modular. It encourages you to tinker and devise alternate systems, or maybe bringing stuff from other games. It makes that much more easy. So it is, in that respect, it encourages individuality, and it encourages experimentation. Now, in terms of more mechanical stuff, characters are very different in old school games as compared to 5th edition. In 5th edition, characters are much more an agglomeration of their powers and abilities, which are on your character sheet. So even a first level fighter in 5th edition has powers and abilities and so forth. Rogues, which are called thieves usually in old school games, they have well-defined powers and abilities beyond simply being thieves. Whereas in old school games, a first level fighter, he can hit things better. There are no special powers for fighters. Magic users, as they're called in first edition, they can cast a spell, and that's it. They don't have any other powers or abilities at first level. And as they go up in levels, they get more spells, and they get higher level spells. But it's not until they hit 7th, 8th level that they start to be able to even do a few things like creating potions or creating magic items. So that sort of thing, there is no steady progression of powers, except in some rare cases like monks get a lot of things at different levels. But again, they're an exception. The core classes, clerics, fighters, magic users, and thieves, they get what they're good at, and that's it. They don't keep getting additional powers, except in the form of they hit things better or they get more spells. And what this does is it forces you as a player to be more creative. In a 5th edition game, you're going to see a lot of people playing off their character sheets, right? You're going to see, okay, this is my situation. Which one of my powers can I use to get out of this situation or to handle this situation? In an old school game, it's much different because you don't have all that much stuff on your character sheet. You might have some magic items. You have your list of spells. You have some equipment. That's it. So you have to be much more creative and inventive when dealing with situations, precisely because you don't have as many special powers. So, for example, coming into a room, you might in a 5th edition game, you might say, "Oh, I'm going to make a perception check." Whereas in a old school game, there's no such thing as a perception check. So you have to explain to the dungeon master exactly what it is you want to do. Oh, I want my character to start looking around that pedestal very carefully, looking for any parts that might slide or move or anything like that. So you have to be more descriptive, more inventive. Let's say you're dealing with a city guardsman who's being stopping you from going somewhere. In a 5th edition game, you could try to roll to intimidate. There's no intimidation in an old school game, so you have to be creative. You have to actually describe what it is you want to do. I'm going to offer him a bribe. I hold up 2 silver pieces and I say, "Are you sure we can't go in?" Something like that. Whereas it's a simple die roll. That's just mechanically derived. In the old school world, it's much more of an improvisation to resolve those kinds of situations. So that's another conceptual thing to do, to change, is working off your character sheet rather than trying to be very inventive with very limited resources when it comes to abilities and skills. Something else when it comes to characters is that you should also realize that some of the character classes that people take for granted now in 5th edition don't exist in older games. The classes, the classic 1st edition AD&D classes are the cleric and druid, the fighter, ranger, paladin, the magic user, illusionist, and the thief and assassin. Later books kind of added a few more things. You started to get barbarians and cavaliers and thief acrobats. Bards as a standalone class weren't a thing until 2nd edition. Although, again, some old school games, some OSR games, kind of brought them in, and they were found in Dragon Magazine and things like that. People had invented it for, so they did exist, but not officially. And you don't have sorcerers. There are just magic users. So there's some things like that when it comes to characters. There's no backgrounds. There's no skills. There's, none of that kind of thing exists as a game mechanic, which is not to say that characters can't have backgrounds, because in old school games, 1st edition, you could absolutely say, "Oh, I'm from here, and this is my family, and this is my story," and so forth, but it's not going to give you any mechanical benefit. And I think that's another important thing to understand, and this goes back to the characters, being very stripped down in terms of the skills and abilities, is that a lot of those things only apply in a role-playing sense, rather than rather than giving you a mechanical benefit that you can use in combat or some other situation. So that's another thing to remember. Now, one other thing to realize about class in OSR is that some OSR games have a concept called race as class. Basically, that means that in addition to fighters and clerics and magic users, dwarves, elves, and halflings are also classes. So you have to, that can be a tough thing for some people to wrap their brains around conceptually. That you have this, you can have a human fighter, a human wizard, and a dwarf, and without a class, because the class is the race. So that is something else to just look out for. It'll be in whatever rules you're using. Rules based on 1st edition don't have that. They just have race over here and class over there, but some based on basic do have that concept of race as class, so something else to watch out for. Now, there's another aspect of old school games compared to 5th edition, and that is the relationship of the dungeon master with the players. In 5th edition, it's very much of a collaborative effort trying to tell a story. right? Usually in a 5th edition game, the Dungeon Master has a story they want to tell, and the players are part of it, and it's very much of a, they're partners in the endeavor. In an old school game, usually the relationship between a Dungeon Master and the players is much more adversarial. Which is not to say that the Dungeon Master is just there to wipe them out. Part of what goes into being a Dungeon Master is understanding that there is a sort of social contract between the Dungeon Master and the players where things have to be fair. And if the Dungeon Master is perceived not to be fair, then his players will seek a game elsewhere, pretty much. So that goes back a little bit to the deadliness of earlier editions compared to 5th. Also, a lot of times, games of old school D&D are location based and they are exploratory, whereas 5th edition is much more story driven, and that can be very jarring for newer players, where they're expecting to see a plot that is unfolding before them. In an old school game, there can be no plot. There are certainly examples of old school games that have a plot, like Dragonlance. That was the archetypical one. But up until that point, and for a long time afterwards, the adventure was just, here's a ruin, go explore it and find whatever treasure's inside. And the plot didn't go any further than that, and it didn't need to, because the exploratory aspect of the game was the game. Whereas today, it's much more about telling a story. So that's something else that you should prepare yourself for, is that it can be a different style of play. That's not to say that you can't play an old school game with a story. It happens all the time, and as I mentioned, Dragonlance was the best example of that. Ravenloft, the original Ravenloft, was another example of where something is story driven. But a lot of times, especially when you get to things like mega dungeons, like my own Castle of Mad Archmage, and there's tons of others, it's much more of an exploratory location-based game, and you can just keep going back to that dungeon, and today we're going to explore level 4, and then 2 weeks later, you say, "Oh no, we want to do level 5 now," and they're not. There doesn't have to be a single story that is being pursued along, from session to session. In such cases, it can be said that the story is emergent. Right, the story is whatever happens to the characters, and rather than the story being something that is sort of agreed upon, at least in the larger scale, and is something that the players and the DM work together to bring about. And just be aware that can be a difference, and it can be jarring if you're not used to it. Now, in terms of the games themselves, there are a lot of options out there. There are a ton of options out there. If you go onto DriveThruRPG, you'll find and search for OSR-type games, you'll find dozens and dozens and dozens, hundreds probably, of different games. I'm just going to go through a couple. Obviously, we have the original. This is 1st edition AD&D. This was the most popular game, the most popular iteration of D&D for a long, long time, until 5th edition came out. This is the one I grew up on, so it has a soft spot in my heart. There is my own game, Adventures Dark and Deep. Yeah. This is basically a restatement of 1st edition AD&D with the extra stuff that Gary Gygax wanted to include, but didn't get a chance to because he left TSR in 1985. So this has additional character classes, like mountebanks and bards and jesters and savants and mystics and things like that. It's got an alternate combat system. It's got just a ton of new material that adds on to 1st edition. But it's all backwards compatible. There is Labyrinth Lord, which is a great treatment of basic D&D. And the differences between basic D&D and advanced D&D mechanically are very small. But this is basically, it's just it's a better organized version. I don't know if you can see it up there. I got the white box. It's like that in terms of its mechanics, but it's much better laid out and written. And then there's also Swords and Wizardry, which is pretty much the same thing. There are minor differences between the two in terms of specifics, but for all intents and purposes, you're not going to, anything that's written for Labyrinth Lord you could use with Swords and Wizardry. And by the way, that goes for just about anything that's OSR. You could take a module that was written for first edition AD&D and play it with Adventures Dark and Deep or Labyrinth Lord or Swords and Wizardry or any one of dozens of other OSR games. And they're all intercompatible because they all share the same basic mechanics. And so that, it's all going to work. This is one I actually really like. This is another version of Basic, whereas Swords of Wizardry and Labyrinth Lord are based on sort of the white box Basic. Blue Home is based on Holmes Basic, which was a box set that came out in the late 70s as an introductory game to get people into D&D. And it has some interesting mechanics, or little tweaks here and there. I mean, again, it's going to be compatible with each other, but this one has a certain charm that I like. So I would, I throw this into because I started with Holmes Basic for a summer and then got into first edition AD&D, and then when they came out with this, it was just like, oh, that's so cool. That's like going home. So anyway, like I say, there's a ton more. These are just a few I had handy that I wanted to point out in terms of the possibilities. There's also, I should also mention Osric, which is a restatement of first edition. I don't have a hard copy. I have the PDF of it, but that's also definitely worth checking out. And I think, in terms of the basics of the differences between 5th and old school, I think that just about covers it. I'm not going to get into specifics of mechanics because, that's the mechanics are going to be a little different. It's a new game. It's a different game. You're going to have to learn it. It's kind of like saying, it's in the same way that Traveller or Call of Cthulhu. It's a different game, but you'll pick it up, like you pick up any game. But in terms of the big picture stuff, the ideology of the game, if you will, this is what you're going to face. So anyway, hope you enjoyed this one. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you are a 5th edition player who's contemplating going to an OSR game, I'd love especially to hear from you. If there's any other advice my old school viewers would like to give to such people, please say so in the comments. Remember, keep it nice. We want to be welcoming to the 5th edition players who are interested in checking out old school gaming. So anyway, hope you enjoyed this one. Let me know what you think, and I will talk to you later. Thanks for watching today's video. Please remember to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Below you'll find links to my Patreon, which helps make these videos possible. You'll also find the web store where you can buy my books, and my blog where you'll find all sorts of free downloads and other articles. Thanks, and have a great day.